In the quiet suburbs of Pine Valley, where manicured lawns stretched beneath towering oak trees, Officer David Thompson patrolled the streets with an air of authority that often bordered on arrogance. Known throughout the department for his strict approach and quick judgment, he took pride in maintaining what he considered a perfect record of keeping the neighborhood safe. On a bright Sunday afternoon in October, the autumn breeze carried the sound of children playing and leaves crunching under bicycle tires. Among them was little Amy, a 9-year-old with pigtails and a bright yellow bicycle, riding just a few houses down from her own home. She wore a pink helmet and had a small basket attached to her handlebars, decorated with colorful ribbons her mother had helped her tie that morning. Officer Thompson, cruising in his patrol car, noticed Amy riding near a house that had reported a break in the previous week. Without hesitation or proper assessment, he pulled his cruiser to the curb, lights flashing. The sudden police presence drew curious glances from nearby residents, who paused their yard work to watch the scene unfold. "Hey you, stop right there." Thompson's voice boomed across the quiet street, causing Amy to freeze in surprise. She nearly lost balance on her bike, her small hands gripping the handlebars tightly. Several neighbors stepped closer, sensing something wasn't right about the situation. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in this area," Thompson announced, approaching Amy with an intimidating stance. "What are you doing here?" His voice carried that edge of authority he perfected over years of service, but this time it trembled slightly with misplaced certainty. Amy's voice shook as she tried to explain. "I live right there, sir," pointing to a beautiful 2-story house just 3 doors down. But Officer Thompson, caught in his own web of assumptions, wasn't listening. He'd already decided this was a situation requiring his intervention. Tears welled up in Amy's eyes as Thompson began reading her rights, his actions drawing gasps from the growing crowd of neighbors. Mrs. Wilson, who lived next door, stepped forward with her phone in hand, recording the incident while attempting to reason with the officer. "Officer, I know this child. She lives right there with her family." But Thompson remained unmoved, handcuffing the frightened girl despite her small wrists barely fitting the metal restraints. He helped her into the back of his patrol car, ignoring the protests of gathering neighbors and Amy's pleading sobs to call her parents. As Thompson prepared to drive away, feeling confident in his decision to apprehend what he believed was a suspicious person, he had no idea that this moment would soon become the biggest mistake of his career. The quiet neighborhood watched in disbelief as the patrol car pulled away, carrying not just any child, but the daughter of Police Chief Lee, who was about to receive a call that would turn this ordinary Sunday into a day that would change the department forever. Officer Thompson drove through the quiet streets, occasionally glancing in his rearview mirror at the small, crying figure in the back seat. The weight of his decision started to press on him as he noticed how young she really looked, but he pushed the doubt aside, convincing himself he was just doing his job. At the police station, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Thompson led Amy through the doors. The usual bustle of the station came to a sudden halt. Officer Jenny White, working the front desk, dropped her coffee mug, causing it to shatter on the floor. Her eyes widened in recognition. She had attended Amy's birthday party just last month at the chief's house. "Thompson," Jenny called out, her voice urgent. "What are you doing?" "That's—" But before she could finish, Sergeant Rivera rushed over, his face pale with shock. The entire station fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by Amy's quiet sniffles. "Take those cuffs off her right now," Sergeant Rivera ordered, his voice tight with controlled anger. Thompson, still not understanding the gravity of the situation, hesitated. "That's Chief Lee's daughter you just arrested for riding her bike in front of her own house." The color drained from Thompson's face as realization hit him like a bucket of ice water. His hands trembled as he quickly removed the handcuffs from Amy's tiny wrists, revealing slight red marks where the metal had been too tight. Office Assistant Maria quickly brought Amy to the break room, offering her hot chocolate and cookies while trying to comfort the frightened child. Meanwhile, Thompson stood frozen in the middle of the station, watching as Sergeant Rivera made the dreaded phone call to Chief Lee. Within minutes, the station doors burst open. Chief Lee, still in his Sunday casual clothes, stormed in with his wife close behind. The look on his face made hardened officers step back. But instead of immediately confronting Thompson, he rushed to his daughter, gathering her in his arms. "Daddy," Amy cried, burying her face in her father's shirt. "I was just riding my bike like you said I could." Mrs. Lee hugged them both, tears streaming down her face as she checked her daughter for any signs of harm. The whole station watched in silence as this family moment unfolded, the reality of Thompson's mistake becoming painfully clear to everyone present. After ensuring his daughter was okay, Chief Lee turned to face Thompson, who had been standing there, looking smaller by the minute. The chief's voice was surprisingly calm, but his eyes blazed with controlled fury. "Officer Thompson, my office. Now." As Thompson followed the chief, his career and future hung by a thread. The other officers watched him pass, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others simply turning away. This Sunday afternoon had turned into a stark reminder that power without judgment could have devastating consequences, especially in a profession meant to protect and serve. The ticking of the wall clock echoed through Chief Lee's office as Thompson stood before his desk, sweat beading on his forehead. The chief sat quietly, reviewing the security footage from Thompson's body camera, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. "Tell me, Officer Thompson," Chief Lee finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with disappointment. "What made you think it was necessary to handcuff a 9-year-old child?" He paused the footage at the moment Thompson approached Amy. "My daughter. On our street, 3 houses away from our home." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his throat dry. "Sir, there had been reports of break-ins in the area, and I thought—" "You thought?" Chief Lee interrupted, standing up slowly. "Did you think about asking her name? Did you think about looking at her school ID in the basket of her bike? Did you think about calling her parents, or checking with the neighbors who were trying to tell you who she was?" The security footage continued playing silently on the screen, showing Amy's tears and the concerned neighbors attempting to intervene. Each frame felt like a hammer hitting Thompson's career. 20 years on the force, Chief Lee continued, pacing behind his desk. "I've watched officers make mistakes. We all do. But this," he gestured to the screen, "this shows a pattern. This isn't your first complaint about excessive force or rushing to judgment, is it?" Thompson's personnel file lay open on the chief's desk, several yellow highlight marks visible on the pages. Complaints from minority residents, reports of aggressive behavior during routine stops, and multiple instances of procedural violations stared back at them. "I've always tried to protect our community," Thompson attempted to explain, his voice barely above a whisper. "Protect." Chief Lee's voice rose slightly. "My daughter was riding her bike in her own neighborhood, Officer Thompson. She wasn't feeling protected when you put her in handcuffs. She was terrified." Outside the office, other officers tried to appear busy while straining to hear the conversation. The news had already spread through the department like wildfire, and phones were buzzing with messages from other precincts. "Sir, please," Thompson began to beg, realizing the full weight of his actions. "I made a terrible mistake. I should have followed proper procedure. I should have listened. I can do better." Chief Lee sat back down, pulling out a form from his desk drawer. "Yes, Officer Thompson, you should have. And now, we both have to face the consequences of your actions. I'm placing you on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation." As Thompson watched the chief begin filling out the paperwork, he realized that his badge, his career, and his reputation were slipping away, all because of assumptions and pride that had finally caught up with him on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The news of Thompson's suspension spread through the police department like wildfire. By Monday morning, a small crowd of reporters gathered outside the station, their cameras ready to capture the unfolding story. Inside, the atmosphere was tense as officers discussed the incident in hushed tones. Meanwhile, at the Lee household, Amy sat curled up on the couch, still shaken from yesterday's events. Her mother had called the school to let them know she'd be staying home today. The sight of her daughter, flinching at the sound of passing police sirens, broke Mrs. Lee's heart. Chief Lee arrived at work early, his inbox already flooded with emails from concerned community members and the police commissioner. The department's internal affairs team had begun their investigation, pulling Thompson's past cases for review. What they found was troubling. A pattern of similar incidents that had been swept under the rug. In the conference room, a community meeting was hastily arranged. Local residents, many of whom had witnessed Amy's arrest, shared their own stories of encounters with Thompson. Mrs. Wilson, the neighbor who had recorded the incident, played her video for the gathering. The footage showed Thompson's complete disregard for proper procedure and the desperate attempts by neighbors to intervene. This isn't just about one incident. A longtime resident spoke up. It's about trust. How can we feel safe in our own neighborhood when those meant to protect us act like this? Back at his home, Thompson sat at his kitchen table, staring at his suspended badge. His phone kept buzzing with messages from fellow officers, some sympathetic, others disappointed. The local news had picked up the story, and his face was now plastered across TV screens throughout the city. The police union representative called, explaining Thompson's rights and the upcoming disciplinary process. But even she seemed distant, her usually protective stance softened by the undeniable evidence and the high-profile nature of the case. As the day progressed, Chief Lee found himself juggling his roles as department head and father. Between meetings about policy reform and calls from city officials, he checked in on Amy, who was slowly beginning to talk about what happened. Her question, "Daddy, why didn't he believe me?" haunted him. By evening, the incident had become a catalyst for change. The department announced mandatory retraining sessions on community relations and de-escalation techniques. City council members called for a review of police procedures, particularly regarding interactions with minors. Thompson watched these developments on his TV, the weight of his actions becoming heavier with each news report. His mistake hadn't just cost him his job. It had shaken an entire community's faith in law enforcement and forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power, judgment, and responsibility. The police department's internal affairs investigation entered its second week, uncovering more concerning details about Thompson's past conduct. The team reviewed body camera footage from his previous arrests, revealing a consistent pattern of rushed judgments and aggressive behavior, particularly in affluent neighborhoods. During a closed-door meeting, the investigation team presented their preliminary findings to Chief Lee. Their report highlighted multiple instances where Thompson had overstepped his authority, though none as dramatic as Amy's arrest. The chief listened intently, his face growing more concerned with each revelation. Meanwhile, Amy had returned to school, but things weren't the same. Her teachers noticed she'd become quieter, more hesitant. During recess, she stayed close to the building instead of playing in the yard. When a police car drove past the school, she tensed up, a reaction that didn't go unnoticed by her concerned teachers. The incident sparked a broader conversation in the community. Local parent groups organized meetings to discuss how to teach their children about interacting with law enforcement. Many shared stories of their own children's fears and confusion about what had happened to Amy. At home, Thompson struggled with his new reality. His neighbors, once friendly, now avoided eye contact. His own daughter, a high school student, came home crying after classmates shared the viral video of Amy's arrest. "Dad, how could you do that to a little girl?" she asked, her voice filled with disappointment. The police union found itself in a difficult position. While they typically defended officers vigorously, the evidence in this case was overwhelming. Their representative met with Thompson to discuss options, none of them promising. The best-case scenario would be a lengthy suspension with mandatory retraining. The worst, termination. Chief Lee implemented immediate changes in the department. New protocols required officers to contact supervisors before any arrest involving minors. Additional training sessions focused on community relations and proper assessment of suspicious activity. The message was clear. What happened to Amy would never happen again. The media continued to follow the story, but their focus shifted from the incident itself to its broader implications. News segments featured experts discussing police training, community trust, and the fine line between maintaining safety and respecting citizens' rights. As the investigation neared its conclusion, Thompson requested a meeting with Chief Lee. He wanted to apologize properly, not just for arresting Amy, but for all the times he'd let his assumptions cloud his judgment. The chief agreed to meet, knowing this conversation would be crucial for both the department's healing and his daughter's recovery. The meeting between Thompson and Chief Lee was set for a quiet Thursday morning. The station felt oddly still as Thompson walked through the familiar hallways, now as a suspended officer rather than an active one. Officers who once greeted him warmly now barely nodded as he passed. Inside the chief's office, Thompson found not only Chief Lee, but also Mrs. Lee and Amy. His heart sank. He hadn't expected the whole family to be there. Amy instinctively moved closer to her mother, while Chief Lee maintained a professional demeanor despite the personal nature of the situation. "Please, sit down." Chief Lee gestured to a chair. Thompson noticed Amy's drawing pad on her lap, filled with pictures that showed police officers as scary figures with angry faces. The sight hit him harder than any official reprimand had. "I came to apologize," Thompson began, his voice trembling slightly. "Not just because I have to, but because I need to. What I did was wrong on every level." He turned to Amy, speaking softly. "I was supposed to make you feel safe, but instead, I scared you. I'm so sorry." Amy looked up from her drawing pad, studying Thompson's face. Mrs. Lee gently squeezed her daughter's hand, encouraging but not pushing. The room fell silent, waiting for Amy's response. "Why didn't you listen to me?" Amy asked, her voice small but clear. "I told you where I lived. I told you my daddy was the police chief." Thompson felt tears forming in his eyes. "I was so focused on trying to catch bad guys that I forgot to see the good in people. I forgot that my job is to protect everyone, especially kids like you." The conversation continued, raw and honest. Thompson shared how the incident had affected his own family, how his daughter couldn't look at him the same way anymore. Chief Lee listened intently, seeing not just an officer who had made a terrible mistake, but a man beginning to understand the true meaning of community service. As the meeting concluded, Amy surprised everyone by offering Thompson one of her drawings. This one showing a police officer helping a little girl find her way home. "Maybe this is how it should have been," she said quietly. Walking out of the station, Thompson knew his career might be over, but something more important had begun. His understanding of what it truly means to protect and serve. The drawing in his hand felt heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. The disciplinary hearing was set for Monday morning at City Hall. The large conference room buzzed with tension as committee members reviewed their notes. Thompson sat alone at one end of the long table, while Chief Lee and other department heads occupied the other side. The Internal Affairs captain presented their findings first, displaying a timeline of Thompson's career. Each incident, when viewed individually, might have seemed minor, but together they painted a picture of an officer who consistently overstepped boundaries. The video of Amy's arrest played on the screen, causing several committee members to shake their heads in disbelief. Thompson's union representative spoke next, acknowledging the severity of the situation while highlighting Thompson's 20 years of service. She mentioned his recent meeting with the Lee family, describing it as a turning point in Thompson's understanding of his actions. When it was Thompson's turn to speak, he stood slowly. "I'm not here to defend my actions," he began. "I'm here to acknowledge them. Every time I put on that badge, I was supposed to make our community safer. But somewhere along the way, I forgot what safety really means." He described how the incident had changed him, how seeing Amy's fear had forced him to confront his own biases. His voice cracked as he mentioned his own daughter's reaction to the video. "I've lost more than just my job," he admitted. "I've lost the trust of my community and my family." Chief Lee watched Thompson carefully. The man standing before the committee was different from the proud, sometimes arrogant officer he'd known. This Thompson spoke with humility and genuine remorse. The committee deliberated for hours. Their decision would affect not just Thompson, but set a precedent for the entire department. When they finally emerged, their faces were solemn. The head of the committee stood, paper in hand. "Officer David Thompson," she began, "after careful consideration of your actions, your history with the department, and your recent acknowledgement of your mistakes, this committee has reached a decision. While we cannot overlook the severity of your conduct, we also cannot ignore your willingness to learn from this incident." The room held its breath, waiting for the verdict that would change not just one career, but potentially the future of community policing in their city. The committee chair continued to read the decision. Thompson would keep his badge, but with significant conditions. He would be demoted, undergo extensive retraining, and spend 6 months working in community outreach programs before returning to active duty. Chief Lee stood up after the verdict. "This isn't just about punishment," he explained. "It's about transformation. Officer Thompson will help develop new training programs, sharing his experience to prevent similar incidents." The following weeks brought major changes to the department. Thompson took on his new role with humility, speaking at training sessions about his mistakes. His story became a powerful teaching tool, especially for newer officers. Amy's case prompted the creation of a youth advisory council, where local children could share their experiences and perspectives with police officers. Amy herself, encouraged by her father, became an active participant, slowly rebuilding her trust in law enforcement. Thompson's first community outreach assignment was at a local elementary school. Standing before a classroom of children, including some who had seen the viral video, he felt more nervous than he'd ever been on patrol. But he shared his story honestly, turning his mistake into a lesson of judgment and understanding. Parents who initially protested Thompson's continued employment began to see changes in his approach. During community meetings, he listened more than he spoke. He spent time learning about different neighborhoods and their unique challenges, something he'd never bothered to do before. His own daughter noticed the change too. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table, reviewing materials for a new training program. "Dad," she said, "I'm proud of how you're trying to fix things." The local media, which had initially condemned Thompson, now covered his involvement in community programs. His story became an example of how accountability and redemption could work together in law enforcement. By year's end, Thompson had become a different kind of officer, one who understood that true authority comes not from a badge, but from the trust of the community you serve. 1 year after the incident, the Pine Valley Police Department held a special community event in the local park. Thompson, now a full-time community relations officer, stood at the podium sharing his journey of transformation. In the audience sat Emmy, no longer afraid, but proudly wearing a junior police badge. Next to her, Chief Lee watched as his daughter raised her hand to ask questions during the Q&A session. Her confidence had returned, stronger than before. Thompson's training program had become a model for other departments across the state. Officers from neighboring cities visited to learn how Pine Valley had turned a potential tragedy into an opportunity for positive change. The police station's walls now display artwork from local children, including Amy's drawing of the friendly police officer. New officers were required to spend their first month in community service before starting patrol duties, a policy that had significantly improved police-community relations. During a private moment at the event, Amy approached Thompson. "Remember when I was scared of you?" she asked. "Now I tell my friends that you're the officer who learned to listen." Her words touched Thompson more deeply than any commendation ever could. Chief Lee addressed the crowd last, speaking about how one incident had reshaped their entire approach to community policing. Sometimes, he said, our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest improvements. The local crime rates had actually decreased, not through aggressive policing, but through better community cooperation. Residents felt more comfortable reporting suspicious activity because they trusted their officers to respond appropriately. Thompson's own daughter had decided to study criminal justice in college, inspired by her father's journey of redemption. "I want to help change the system from within," she told him proudly. As the event concluded, Thompson watched children playing freely in the park, some waving to passing patrol cars instead of running away. He realized that true justice wasn't about power or authority. It was about building trust, one interaction at a time.